Diminished seventh chords are one of the most fundamental concepts in all of jazz, but yet they intimidate so many people. These are tense chords that need to be resolved, and I think that can be a little bit scary. What if I resolve it wrong? Will I anger the jazz gods? Will my audience howl in protest if I follow it up with the wrong chord? But don't worry, because I'm not going to let that happen to you. Today, I'm going to show you everything you need to know about diminished chords so that you can play them cool and confident. Diminished seventh chord is simply a stack of 4 notes, which are all a minor third apart, like this: C, E flat, F sharp, and A. Because these chords are symmetrical, there's actually only 3 of them to learn. There's a C diminished chord, a C sharp diminished chord, and a D diminished chord. After that, we just start getting inversions of the same chords. So for example, E flat diminished is the same as C diminished. And so when we're playing tunes and we see a diminished chord written on our lead sheet, this is exactly what you play. But that's not really the topic we're here for today. We want to know how to use these diminished chords, even when those chords are not written explicitly in the chart. We want to play them as sexy movements between our chords. Or maybe we want to color up our dominant chords with extensions and alterations. We might even want to use them to play a block chord sound like George Shearing. There's a ton for us to cover here, so let's dive right in. Let's start with a little bit of a cheat code. Let's say you're jamming out here to When You Wish Upon a Star, and you think to yourself, I really want more tension in this moment. Specifically, I want to add some kind of tension and release after this D minor chord as we're going into the G7 chord. What diminished chord could I use in here? Here's my trick to answer that. We're going to look at the chord we're going to, in this case G7, and we're just going to pick any note we want from that G7 chord. From there, we can play any diminished chord that's a half step away from that note. As one example, we could look at our G7 chord and just pick the B natural to be our target. And then we could pick a diminished chord a half step above or below that, either C diminished or B flat diminished, and then use that to play into the G7. These are pretty different sounds, but they both work great. You can take this simple concept quite a long way. I recommend spending some time experimenting with this by inserting movements all over your songs. Try using your melody note as a target and pick a diminished chord above or below that. Or make sure you practice using the 1, the 3, the 5, and the 7 as your target notes. There are so many different options to play with. Over time, you'll start to get an intuition which will guide you toward which ones to use in what situation. Next, I want to talk about the relationship between diminished chords and dominant chords. Now, just like our diminished chords, the function of a dominant chord is to create tension. In fact, our dominant chords literally come from diminished chords. Take a look at this B diminished chord, which has a B, a D, an F, and an A flat in it. If we lower the B by a half step, we get a B flat dominant 7th chord. Barry Harris used to say that the B flat 7 chord is a child of the B diminished. And the same is true for all the notes in this diminished chord. We could lower the D to D flat instead, and now we have D flat 7. We could lower the F to E, and now we have E7, or we could lower the A flat down to make A7. This opens up a few opportunities for us. One thing we could take away is that we could just play a diminished chord instead of the dominant. This is basically just a rootless voicing with a flat 9. The B diminished chord has D, our 3rd, F, our 5th, A flat, our 7th, and also C flat, which is our flat 9. If we put the B flat down in the bass, we're good to go. Beyond that, these 4 dominant chords are connected to each other, kind of like they're a family. They all have the same mom, B diminished. In fact, Barry used to call them brothers and sisters. And so you can substitute them for each other. This G7 chord could potentially be replaced with any of its brothers or sisters, the B flat 7, the D flat 7, or the E7. Now you have to keep Josh's golden rule of jazz in mind here, which is that the melody and the harmony must work together. So I would probably avoid this B flat 7 because the melody note is a B natural. Maybe an E7 would work better because B is the 5th of E7. I I have spent hours, days, and weeks experimenting with this idea to try and find all the fun substitutions, and there's a lot to discover when you do that. But let's not stop here. Why substitute one chord for another when you could combine them together? Yeah, you heard that right. We're actually going to play both chords together at the same time. This is called an upper structure, and it gives us another way to think about our extensions and altered chords. I recommend voicing these chords with just the shell of the main chord in our left hand. So for G7, I'm just playing F and B. That's our third and seventh. In the right hand, we play our other chord. Generally, I just play a triad and I invert it in a way that keeps our hands close together. That way they sound like a single unified chord. And this works for all of the brothers and sisters. Let's look at them one at a time. If we play G7 with a B flat major on top, it's the same as G7 with a sharp 9. But if we play that G7 with an A major on top, we get G7 with a flat 9. And if you put the D flat major on top, you get G7 with a sharp 11 and a flat 13. So this is kind of a neat shortcut to get some really sophisticated jazz sounds. Now Barry would take this further, building 6 diminished movements on top of each of these as well. And we're not going to go down that road today, but I think it's a nice trick to use to make it simpler to find some of our altered voicings. My favorite way of doing this is that I look at the melody note, and then I look for a brother chord that has that melody note in it, kind of like we do here at the end of the song. Alright, we could talk about dominant chords all day, but let's take a look at major and minor chords too. Take this C diminished chord. If we pick 2 adjacent notes from this chord and we move them up by a half step, we get a major 6 chord. So for example, we could take the second and third notes, E flat and F sharp, and if we move them up, we get C major 6. And this works going down too. If we take those same 2 notes, but we lower them instead, now we get F major 6. And we've only talked about the second and third notes of this chord, but it works with any 2 adjacent notes. This is amazing to me because just this one diminished chord connects us with 8 different major chords. And it works for our minor 6 chords too, but in this case we're just going to raise a single note by a half step instead. To take this to even another level, Barry Harris told us that we could voice any major chord by playing a 6th chord on the 5th. So here on C6, we could play a G6 chord with a C in the bass. And we can go back and forth between this G6 voicing and the regular C6, and that creates some motion. And if we put this diminished chord we picked in between the 2, we can jazz it up even more. This is a classic chord movement that we've heard in music for all time. It always makes me think of Burt Bacharach, though. So now that we understand how these diminished chords connect to dominant and major and minor chords, we can look at 3 of the most common movements we see in our jazz standards. The first one of those is the diminished chord below the 2 chord. So here in the key of C, our 2 chord is D minor. And if we play the diminished chord a half step below that, we get this chord. Earlier we learned that we could lower any note in a diminished chord to get a dominant. In this case, we could lower our B flat and get an A7 chord. That A7 chord is the 5 chord to D minor. So in a sense, this diminished chord is just a secondary dominant for that D minor chord. This is the same principle behind the famous sharp 4 blues walk-up that we've all heard a million times. So here in C, our F sharp diminished chord, which is our sharp 4, is a half step below our 5 chord. That F sharp diminished is basically just a D7. It's a secondary dominant that's taking us to the G. This is all starting to get a little bit too heady and theoretical. To be more practical, I just think of this as a diminished chord chromatically stuck in between 2 chords. So if we think about it practically like this, we could look at our flat 3 diminished. And this flat 3 diminished just wants to move chromatically. It could go down to our minor 2 chord or up to the minor 3. We could also play in a block chord style where we alternate our bass chord with a diminished chord. And we do that by starting with a scale, like this C major scale. Whenever our melody note is one of our chord tones, we're going to play a C6 chord. But if our melody is a non-chord tone, you guessed it, we're going to play a diminished chord instead. And that gives us a scale that sounds like this. When we expand this idea to each of the chords of our song and we introduce a swing feel, we can play When You Wish Upon a Star just like George Shearing might have. There's a lot more for you to consider if you want to sound like George Shearing, but lucky for you, I made a whole video dedicated just to that, which you can watch right here, right now.